Hi Patreon, it's Nick. It's just about the end of the month, and that means it is high time for our second tutorial video. I've been thinking about this for a little bit, and I think one of the best next steps and the best sort of things I might have to offer in terms of sort of just stuff that I'm able to share that I feel like I know well enough to actually kind of give advice on is character design basics. So this tutorial video is going to focus largely on some of the building blocks for character design and what I do on a pretty much a daily basis. So this opening slide is a whole bunch of Jellybot's work that you've seen over the last couple of months that we've been working on together. Um, all of that stems from a couple of really basic, grounded things that I worked on, especially during my time in art school. I went to RISD. One thing I know for sure, based on that experience, is that art schools are really expensive. Um, and I'm hoping to be able to sort of distill some of the stuff that I learned from that experience into a video like this that you can just have for a lot less than $40,000 a year or whatever on earth the price is these days. So let's dig in. By the nature of this is probably going to be that this is more sort of illustrated talk than explicitly like a technique demo. Hopefully that's cool and it's going to be useful for you either way. Um, but just a heads up. So one major thing about character design that people ask about is sort of shape language. And it's interesting to me that we even have that phrase, shape language, because it is telling. Like there is an aspect of communication to it. Um, and I find that one of the things I like the most about character design is not that it's just shapes, but the way in which those shapes are a language. I think that there's so many approaches and ways to actually come to this as a career and do this on the regular. And there are a lot of different schools of thought. Um, and mine is just going to be just one of those, one of many. So won't at any point claim to be like the authority on this stuff or in any way sort of finished learning, which is certainly not the case. But there have been a bunch of principles and basic building blocks that have been a huge help to me, like a really big um, set of revelations along the way, especially in college, that have sort of informed my approach since then. Um, and so I'm just doodling as we talk, just thinking about shapes. Um, and because they've been so formative for me, I'm going to try to share, walk through some of the nuances of those with you guys. Um, I think there's certain approaches. People are more shape oriented, more just like sort of immediate visual, sort of candy oriented. Um, that's not really my jam. I'm just the kind of personality I am, the kind of stuff that draws me to this has always been a lot more um, sort of conceptual. I've always been like way more interested in the the big kind of concepts and sort of a more of an ambitious idea of what character design can mean and what it can be about and what it can accomplish, rather than just be sort of a collection of like sick shapes, bro. And there's really nothing wrong with that either, and that's something that I've been learning over time to kind of get over is my own like propensity towards like a sort of elitism of like, well, either thoughtfulness and shape is all or GTFO. But um, I think there's a lot to learn from both things. You have to have a strong basis in really basic appeal, in anatomy and in ability to draw, to make something that people think is just really cool and really fun to look at, and compelling and sticks in the memory. But there are also like underlying principles that make that stuff more substantial. I would say it's a little bit like creating something that's flavored like something nutritious and good versus actually making like a full meal with all the different vitamins, minerals, ingredients, and stuff like that that you're putting together. You can either have some strawberry flavored candy that kind of reminds you of strawberry, or you can have something that has like the actual nutrients that you need. Um, so I think in design there's an equivalent to that. There's stuff that just looks cool and kind of hits it, and then there's stuff that like the more you dig and the more that you look at it, the more that it unfolds and it's rich that way. So um, one thing I want to say before I jump in and more meaningfully is that a lot of what I'm going to be talking about, especially when it comes to symbol and metaphor and storytelling, when it comes to these shapes, they touch on these like major iconic ideas. Those are not for all time necessarily. Those are not the final word on it. It's kind of a framework. The ideas behind sort of the quote unquote rules of character design um, stem from thousands of years of history and tradition in the culture that I'm raised to, kind of a European heritage. Like, I come from a very particular background. I was raised overseas, traveling in Europe. My thoughts on shape and color and design are going to be influenced by some of those traditions. Uh, that's not the only way to think about it, and so I wouldn't ever suggest that what I'm going to talk about here is like the only way to think about character color and shape. But even in approaching that, one thing that I wanted to talk about was it's just called Commedia. I believe it's with two D's. Commedia dell'arte. Commedia dell'arte is like an ancient Italian form of theater, um, and very classical. You've probably seen those Venetian masks, and each different mask has a different character, and they have names: Pantalone, Capitano. The different characters are signified by the mask that the actor wears. So when you see somebody in Commedia dell'arte, this traditional Italian theater, come out um, wearing the Pantalone mask, for instance, the audience is trained to look at that mask, look at the shapes on the actor's face, and immediately, I know who that is. I know who I can expect that to be. Um, and that's really what we're going to be talking about with character design. It's not necessarily this is true about all people of all time. This is like, but because of the media we've consumed in the theater we've been inundated with, because of the stories our culture tells itself, these are, generally speaking, I found some really effective ways of immediately cueing some of those feelings. When you see that mask, when you see that particular set of shapes and colors, those evoke something for you. And I think sometimes those things are sort of there's like the surface level of culture where the grass grows, right? Um, and then underneath that, there are layers of like it gets more and more visceral and eternal the further down you go, more deeply human. I'll recommend some sources and some reading and some other visual stuff as we go along. That'll dig into it. Um, but I think, yeah, the mask theater of Commedia dell'arte is like a good way of thinking through some of this stuff. So, all that said, kind of a really long preamble. Sorry about that. But character design, as it's been explained to me, as I've understood, breaks into the understanding of the language of basically three, we'll say four basic shapes. Um, there's so many principles, there's so much to dig into, but these four shapes, the circle, the square, the upward pointing triangle, and the downward pointing triangle, um, I find them to be sort of the fundamental building blocks of what we're talking about here. Probably some of you, especially if you're contrarians like me, are going to be hearing some of this stuff and react like, "Oh, that's not true," and you could think of counterexamples. Totally legit. Um, but I think there's some truth here and some thoughts worth at least beginning with. So the circle. Uh, Circle is my favorite shape, and I would suggest that it is kind of all our favorite shapes. Um, a circle evokes comfort, wholeness, the idea of a cycle, the roundness of it. There's no edges, there's no pointy, spiky bits, there's no asymmetry on any vector. It's symmetrical down every axis that you throw through its center. Um, the circle is soothing because of its roundness. It's easy and pleasant to look at. A couple sort of key facts, right? Like the circle, we have a giant circle in the sky, two of them, in fact. And they are a source of light and life, like that sort of primal sense of um, comfort derives from the dawning of the sun, right? And so having this giant circular orb that means warmth and light definitely has something to do with that. Simple fact, and one of the things that was always like really effective in explaining the circle's appeal to me, and we'll get a little weird, but I mean the first thing that a human baby sees and knows to want and associate with comfort and life force is the breast, and specifically the nipple of its mother. It's weird, and it's fact that the nipples on pretty much any mammal will darken and become more clear and contrasty, high contrast, around birth, so that the baby whose eyesight's not very developed can see it really easily. Um, that basic association has, I would suggest, sort of created an association of the circle with motherhood, the circle of the pregnant body. Um, Someone who's with child has the sort of the the symbol of the circle on them. Um, we are raised with a lot of cultural symbols that involve primal sort of circle motifs that we see as like sort of very comforting and surrogate. There's no accident here. And even it's a fact too that's fun about this particular shape, that this is Mickey Mouse from the front and Mickey Mouse from the side in the cartoon. If you look at like when they animate him, it's just this. They never go sidelong on his ears because that loses the essential appeal of the fact that he is just beautiful three cluster of three circles in an iconic and immediately recognizable formation. The circle is like something that I use in character design all the time. We'll take a little quick trip into that. Um, a Baymax maximum appeal, right? You've got that big egg-shaped body, right? Big circular forms, circle for the head, little circles for eyes. Even his limbs are all rounded off. There's a statue, if you look it up, called the Venus of Willendorf, and that's basically this ancient statue, very pear-shaped. The pear shape itself, the egg shape, all derived from the circle, all sort of symbolize life and life force. Comfort, two big old circles involved in creating Baymax. Everything's soft, everything's gentle. We associate it with childcare. And in fact, if you remember the movie Big Hero 6, Baymax's whole role within that film is a caregiver. So the sort of simple egg-like incubating circularity. He's also completely symmetrical on either side of him. So that's another factor we like, except for his little heart bit circle that actually you can access, and that's how he is changed, or how the brother within him is accessed, and how we when we I don't think it's an accident that there's an asymmetrical element to him, and that's the thing we're meant to notice. It's also the thing that um, that changes our understanding of his character away from just the simple understanding of him as a perfect caretaking robot. Um, Other famous circles? We'll get into the specific symbolism of this. Um, there's this sort of dated example of the original iPod, which is still an iconic design. The click wheel, just this like total eyeball breast motif. Eyeballs too. I mean, when you look at someone, you look at them right in their circles, and we associate big eyes and with like a sort of trustworthiness. Um, there's you know, again, the bigger the iris too. There's always like a comfort with that. Also means like sort of the dilated, uh, big wide pupil um, gives us a sense of the. If you look into the psychology of pupil dilation, right, that means that they're seeing something that you're comforted by. So your circle gets bigger. It's Mike Wazowski, except I should grab a picture of Mike Wazowski before I pretend that I actually know how to draw him. Um, so these basic circular forms are huge in terms of creating appeal. Something that I use in Jellybots a lot. Um, Sort of big rounded circular formation. A big um, sort of soft shape user that I really love is Chris Sanders. I really should have gotten more of his work as an example, but even in the industrial design space, his ships in Lilo and Stitch. There's just in case you don't know, Chris Sanders. Um, his shape language is so soft. Even Stitch has a lot of really Stitch and Nani and Lilo. Just all the characters really have a soft, sort of squishy, circular appeal, even in all of their forms and angles. Um, it really adds a particular flavor and a particular, like I said, yeah, like a comforting vibe to those. It's also, I would suggest, one of the reasons that those toys sell pretty well, specifically Stitch. Um, Great circle usage. So the circle we think of as a, sort of this cycle, um, the the yin yang circle sort of spiraling in on itself as a symbol not of chaos or even specifically of conflict. It's perfect balance, right? You've got circles within circles. Um, so that shape is one that I like I say I employ a lot in my work. I think about a lot. But equally important and certainly a big structural character design foundational shape is the square or the rectangle. Um, and the square is order. Um, let's see. Let's just list some words here. So we had comfort, cycle, appeal. The square is by contrast. It's about order. It's about structure, modularity, and so civilization and society are both symbolized by the square. We live in big squares full of rectangles. We live in square rooms. We play with structured toys that are made of squares and circles that stack on each other. But the main thing about a square, obviously, is that or a rectangle, I should say, is that they stack neatly to form structures. There's something very regimented and very, the edges in a square also symmetrical in every direction, right? Um, we find that comforting and appealing. Symmetry is something. It was suggested to me by a professor that the symmetry is as primal as our basic understanding of healthiness in a child, for instance. A symmetrical baby is a healthy baby. We like that. We like our celebrities to be beautiful and symmetrical and have an even eye on either side. When we take away symmetry, characters like Scar or Captain Hook, um, as like sort of immediate examples, there's an unsettling quality to that goes deeper than just I would say symbolically goes deeper than just that we have a mistrust of of people with disabilities or something like that. But there is the fact that it throws the design into asymmetry and sort of throws your idea of what should be naturally the natural order of the face or the body is interrupted. And so that has an effect. It can have a positive or negative effect depending on how you use it, but symmetry is a big part of the psychology and symbolism of character design. So the square, we have a lot of symmetry going on, similar to the circle. But now we have some corners. Now we have some edges. There's an absolutism. Square is kind of lawful neutral. Um, and so we see it used in a lot of ways that evoke that social order. Um, a couple sort of important squares. We showed you the Death Star earlier, right? So the Death Star is a great symbolic example of all of this, right? You have the circle from afar, right? You're approaching. It's a circle within a circle, so it's just this giant planetary comfort breast hanging in the middle of space, right? Oh, look at that. It's a planet, it's a moon. It's got to be a moon. And when we get closer in, that's no moon. Um, and you see, of course, in fact, that the moon, is made of a whole bunch of squares. So upon closer inspection, what unfolds about the Death Star is that it's constructed, and we key visually that it's constructed, it's a false moon, by showing that once you get close up to it, it's actually constructed of squares entirely. Um, a lesser sort of, but certainly memorable for those. Again, this is a pretty dated reference, but the Borg cube from Star Trek um, is a pretty classic sort of symbolic square thing. It's a giant cube that floats in space, and the Borg are all about assimilation into their social order. They're kind of robot zombies of Star Trek. And so the sort of super constructionist sort of, it's chaotic, the Borg cube, ultimately. Like, it has all this jumble, but it resolves at a distance into a perfectly symmetrical ordered cube. um, so that's a key sort of structure of that symbol. um, if we classically associate the circle with pregnancy, breast, mother, comfort, nurturing cycles, the square tends to be classically, again, associated with with fatherhood, with order, with yeah, that kind of hard, structural, important learning and leadership, the conformity, um, and a lot of those things that are associated with a certain type of old world masculinity. Um, so squarishness and the use of square shapes definitely evokes certain things like that. You can round off the square, right? Which, how do you make the app store look more appealing? But they are apps, so you have this structured screen full of squares, little chiclets, right? But they're comforting, rounded. There's some hybrid between the comfort of the circle, right, the app icons, and the structure of the square. Um, Certain people think in sort of round circles and cycles. I think I veer a little towards that. Some people think in structural sort of building blocks and systems and sort of linear, sort of more left brained, maybe, um, which is a profoundly positive and useful thing that maybe gets a bad rap sometimes. But often that is, again, square shapes, sort of circuitry, buildings. Um, all these kinds of things are symbolized in the square. Another sort of visual example of what I'm talking about there. It's getting messy. Um, I mean, it always was gonna get messy. Um, this is what happens when you don't think like squares. Um, Another great example, Star Wars in particular, was one of the ways that this was all unlocked for me, was having my professor who loved Star Wars explain a lot of his understandings of this through that lens. Um, and one of the great examples here is sort of their robot, right? He is a iconic robot, right? And you can reduce R2D2 into his constituent shapes, right? So you've got this great robot. He is a cylindrical dude. Oh my gosh, sorry, I keep grabbing the wrong brush. Here we go. The reed is rectangular, right? But in fact, when he turns around, he's cylindrical, right? But his iconic silhouette breaking thing is this dome. So he's a rectangle that rounds off into the appeal of a circle. He's got the sort of proportion of a baby. He's got like a big circular head and kind of a little body, which has its own sort of fundamental design appeal, right? Um, he sits on it. If you see these from the side, they're triangular shapes, right? He sits on these triangles, which we'll get to. Um, but of course, right dead center is his cluster of little iconic circles. He's covered in sort of square shapes, but a bunch of round shapes too. Um, but we look him right in his big, sympathetic, shiny circle. Um, and so I think once again, it's a really like deft use of these different, really basic primal shapes that makes R2D2 as iconic as he is. He's obviously a robot, structural, right? But he is a little baby. He burbles to himself. He kind of is the little kind of helpless but thoughtful. He's got a wisdom going on to him. Well, maybe C3PO is more book learning and structured. R2D2 uh, has that sort of natural appeal. And again, one of the things that I find in character design I'm always reaching for and that I love, in other designs is that iconic quality. The idea that you can break something down into its most basic forms, and we'll get to that in a bit, and still be able to recognize it from even a really long distance or reduced to like a literal icon, a literal little app logo. Um, those forms are powerful forms. If an adult can render it richly, but a kid can also draw it crudely with a crayon, and everyone recognizes it, that's powerful design. R2D2 is basically one of those designs. Um, so let's take a look then at the triangles. So actually, I'm going to go in reverse here. The downward pointing triangle. Um, Here we go. Upward triangle. And downward. Man, my brain when I'm trying to talk and draw at the same time. Sorry, everything's so sketchy and loose and blobby, but hopefully it's more the ideas are coming across, and we'll get to how they're used in a really short bit. But um, so the upward triangle uh, is grounded, right? You have that strong base. It's got a broad, strong base, and it comes to a point that points up to the sky. The downward pointing triangle sort of top heavy and comes to a point, sort of a pinnacle, and that's sort of our understanding of gravity is really fundamental to us too, right? So we understand when we even see a shape on a 2D plane divorced of context, we still assign a top and a bottom to it, and that top and bottom read affects how we perceive it and some of the things we associate with it. So the downward pointing triangle is a really powerful one. Both triangles together are very dynamic shapes, rather than the circle and the square, which are both sort of symmetrical on two dimensions. These guys only have sort of one line of symmetry, and are, yeah, pretty dramatic in terms of they're always directional, right? Obviously, the arrow is always built fundamentally out of sort of a line and a big triangle indicating the direction. We just understand symbolically that a triangle is pointing us in a direction. Um, the downward pointing triangle is pointing us down. So we see this as something balanced on its point, which means that it's inherently unstable. It could fall either way. It could sort of teeter. A downward pointing triangle is a little bit untrustworthy, if we're honest. So an upward pointing triangle has a firm, solid base and is unlikely to be shaken. Um, the other thing that I read, and I need to find this book. There's a book that breaks down the story of Little Red Riding Hood into cut paper pieces that are just shapes, and sort of builds this illustration of Red Riding Hood and the wolf out of the basic shapes as the author explains what those shapes signify and how adding them in different sort of arrangements changes the meaning and the way we read the image. But one of the powerful examples of that, they build the wolf out of several triangles, um, and it doesn't become threatening until they add its teeth, which are just this series of downward pointing triangles. And if we're honest, all pointy teeth are fundamentally and deeply on like a gut level threatening. Um, but we seem to have an obsession with the canines, right? The downward pointing triangles. Those are the true predatory teeth. Those are the ripping, tearing, scary teeth. Um, so that to me is that's enough in terms of justifying the nature of our reaction, at least traditionally, to the downward pointing triangle. Is that it evokes a sort of the shape of a predator, and a lot of predators have a lot of that language to them. Sharks, or the shark fin, is obviously, upward pointing triangle, but the pointed intensity of their shapes. The worst shark in the world. Um, those blade-like protrusions and shapes really have a powerful effect on us psychologically. Um, and we'll walk through some examples in a second. And so the downward pointing triangle we usually use in villains and sort of threatening and imbalancing things. Um, it's a negative shape. Tends to be a negative shape in general. It's pushing us, pressing down, gravity-wise. The upper triangle has a solid base. It's got its sort of feet underneath it, right? And it's aspiring. The pyramids have this sort of profound, enormous, iconic quality to them, being that they're these. We assign this immediate sort of spiritual significance to that shape. And again, this is what's been passed on to me with the triangles. I'm very convinced of the downward pointing triangle. If I'm honest with myself, I'm still figuring out how much I do believe about the upward pointing triangle. But certainly, as the Illuminati symbol, right, the eye and the pyramid and all that, it's definitely gotten a lot of sort of exposure as a symbol. Um, my professor always would evoke the Star of David as sort of a perfectly balanced symbol that indicated the the entirety of the human experience, sort of the downward pull towards of gravity and the upward pull towards the divine and towards God. And so, at least theoretically, we see the upward pointing triangle as something that is aspirational and spiritual, something that evokes that looking towards the heavens. Um, so I know that's a bit dense and it's very sort of high theory, but to me this was like a complete eye-opening, crazy set of revelations when I was beginning my journey as a character designer. And the more I've thought about it over the years and tried it out and used it, the more some of these symbols and ideas really still resonate for me. So let's take a look at a couple of examples, and I'll just sort of break down a little bit more of what I see. So we're just talking about the upward pointing triangle. One of my favorite sort of simple examples is Obi-Wan Kenobi, who is your classic wise old man, right? But there's a reason that the spiritual power of the Jedi in Star Wars, right, is associated with. There's so many kinds of hoods, right? You can have all these hoods, but only the hood that goes all the way out to the shoulders, and basically the robe that turns you into one giant upward pointing triangle, um, is associated with the Jedi. Of course, as I'm saying this, I'm thinking of, and you're probably thinking of, other white triangular hoods that are classically evil and very upsetting Ku Klux Klan shapes. Um, that's a key factor of this too, is that real life organizations and things that we associate with evil, symbols take on new meanings as you go. Um, we would argue that maybe the upward pointing triangle and the hooded shape here is inherently positive and spiritually, leading toward enlightenment. You may think of another religious figure who notably, hold on a second, traditionally and throughout history has had a giant upward pointing triangle on his head. Again, it's really revealing sort of how badly I sketch when I'm talking and trying to explain things. But the Pope. So yeah, what did the Ku Klux Klan, the Pope, and the Jedi all have in common? Upper pointing triangles. Yep, you've got your Pope. We'll just draw them all. You got your Ku Klux Klan, white racists, horrible, and you've got your Jedi robes. Um, those symbols all sort of actually speak the same thing. Now, there's no way an apologetic for any kind of Ku Klux Klan, but those negative symbols come from positive symbols. And it's important that we acknowledge that and understand that a villain doesn't design themselves as evil. Their evil actions make the symbols associated with negative things. A mask that covers the full face. I mean, both of these things. That's another key feature, right? Is in character design that the Jedi show their faces, even though they're hooded and they're it's sort of a secret order and secretive, and it evokes the monastic kind of look of monks, as well as sort of the diagonal kind of angles of traditional Japanese costuming. Um, the Pope's just wearing a giant sort of pyramid church steeple on his head, sort of indicating the divine, the top of the body. It's drawing the energy up. Um, Key difference in the Ku Klux Klan member is it is completely identity obscuring. The mask shows none of their face, right? And that's an interesting character design note. The negativity we might associate that is to do with the obscuring and the mystifying quality of taking away their face. Um, Usually that's untrustworthy. So that's another interesting character design note for the future. But they themselves think of themselves as heroic and heroes, and so it's important to bear in mind. Um, Speaking of villains and triangles, Jafar I find to be a pretty compelling example of just like the biggest, most classic, kind of played out. I mean, Jafar defines this like curvy blade-like downward pointing triangle motif within the scope of the Aladdin cast. The Cobra hood classic thing, right? Cobra's great because you've got this with a Cobra, right? You've got your downward pointing triangle, and you get even another downward pointing triangle. And if you really want, you can just add more. So Cobra's just one of those like super easy gimmies on the downward pointing triangle thing. This hat has a roundness to it, right? But if you recall, even it has kind of a general downward point. His turban has a downward kind of egg-shaped quality. Um, his cape pulls the shape up, right? But it's not the cape that you remember. It's not the full caped upward triangle that he's creating, as much as it is the powerful high contrast black downward pointing triangle. So it's not just the symbols that are used in the design, but it's the symbols that are the highest contrast, the things that actually stick in the memory, the things that you associate with a character. Maleficent, right? Has all kinds of shapes in her cape and clothing, but the most iconic are her horns, right? You got the great big black horns that create, once again, big downward pointing triangle on her head. As we talk about this, to another major aspect of the design work here, beyond just the symbol of shapes, is then how you work those out within the design to tell a story about the character. Jafar is delightful. Animation, I find, is a really great place to look for hints and ideas about character design because they have to boil it down to its most simple um, color shapes and ideas to get it across, because you don't want an animated, especially 2D animated character, to be super complicated, because you have to draw them again and again, you have to animate them, fit them in every scene. um, that's changing now with CG, but this classic kind of look. So we've got, once again, this big sort of pointed, shouldery, downward pointing triangle of his robes. Um, his head is exaggerated by the shape of his turban, but even though within the cast, and I actually think I have a picture of the cast lineup broken down. This is kind of a cool find, unless I was looking for stuff. Um, they break down. This is like from a Disney thing of breaking down the shapes. Notice here, even it's super blurry, but that the Sultan's turban is a subtle upward pointing triangle, whereas the tendency of Jafar's turban is to reinforce that downward shape. Other things are at play here, right? He's gaunt. He's thin. Um, we have associations with that. The thinner a person is, um, we have a certain associations. It depends. Certainly in fashion, that's associated with desirability. It's an attractive kind of thing in terms of trend. But we do associate it with vulnerability, with starvation. Um, the more spindly and narrow, his hands are claw like and thin. We associate that with just skeletons, with death. And so the imagery, the really pronounced cheekbones, the spindly pointed fingers, we associate those things with death. Black and red are primal markings on a snake that warn us of poison and to get the hell out. Um, there's a whole other section we could do about the symbology of color, um, but there are certainly, again, thinking about commedia dell'arte, these things can be subverted and changed, but there are fundamental things. There's a reason why we associate black with negativity and mystery, because when the world goes dark, the predators come out and eat us. Like when the sun goes away, um, that's when danger is increased from a really primal place. The darkness of night evokes mystery, um, and a sense of threat and fear. Red is just blood. There's all sorts of other connotations, passion and love, and um, sort of an earthy and emotional quality. Uh, but a lot of that stems from the very basic association that when you see red, there's blood. Black and red, poisonous snakes. Black, night and mystery. Red, blood, fire, things that are primally threatening. So Jafar is this, like, he just hits every classic villain symbol on the way out of the character design tree. The last thing that I love about Jafar is his twisted beard. He's all these pointy shapes right up in his head, and his toe, it curls up and becomes this spiral. Jafar is this character associated with, he's kind of off. He's the weird one in the cast. Um, this actually unites him in the designs of the Aladdin cast with Genie, who also has the spiral motifs of the sort of a question mark, mystery, and we associate this sort of spiraling um, with certain. It's not as primal as circle, square, triangle, um, but certainly curving S curves, smokiness, snakes, serpents. Um, it's a mysterious association that we have. I don't mean that the association is mysterious. I mean that we associate it with mystery, um, with a coiling, cyclical kind of. And so there's no accident that the character who's associated with magic is associated with the spiral, with nature, with kind of a. It's chaotic, a spiral, especially his beard shape. It kind of twists in kind of unpredictable ways. Everything else is these big straight lines and shapes, but the spiraling shape of his beard is this more organic twisty, kind of unpredictable note on his character design, um, which I would say is probably pretty important. Um, Major classics, right? So a lot of these things seemed like weird, lofty theories, and until I started to really look at some huge examples. And Pixar is a big exporter of highly symbolic character design stuff. Um, and I love that because I think within the space of Wally and Eve here, there's so much storytelling in just the still frames of both of them. Even standing still, even without an expression. Wally is a robot, so his expression is always more or less baked in. His eyes move and his arms can move and give him a lot of expressiveness. Um, but inherently, he has this sad expression on his face. The shape of the sort of eye socket is that sort of sad, sort of teardrop, like earnest, like kind of look. Lends itself easily to that. Um, he is always a box. He is a box that makes boxes. I mean, if you remember in the movie, he stacks boxes endlessly. That's his job. He's an agent of order in a chaotic world. Uh, he's rusty and alone, and that tells a part of the story. He I believe that the treads on him are triangular as well. To get a side view of that. A little more round, but also triangular, heroic. This overall shape gives us an upward pointing triangle. These eye sockets are endearing, but also evoke that triangular form. But for everything on him is boxes, 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 squares, rectangles, on rectangles, within rectangles. Except, boom, big ol' circles. So right in his earnest eyes, we get an indication of comfort and sentience and sort of a human note right in his eyes. So we thoroughly communicate that he's a robot with a soul. Um, that's always an easy gimme with most robot designs. They tend to have round eyes. Um, but if you think about other examples where the eyes are obscured or made into sort of narrow slits, that's always threatening. It's just how expression tends to work for us too. When you narrow your eyes and you squint them and you make an angry face, we associate that with threat, with anger. Um, and big, round, wide eyes tend to be, again, this is very, very much from a Western tradition, but tend to evoke that appeal and sort of that natural, like baby-like vulnerability, humanity, and connection. Eve is amazing, right? Because by contrast, he's so worn and dirty and square. Everything on Eve is round and super clean. Tells the story of where she's from. It tells the story of how they're so different. While Wally is an agent of order and squares, Eve is an agent of a little bit of chaos. She brings chaos to Wally's ordered world, right? Um, she brings circularity, sort of a. She doesn't fit into the boxes he's creating. Uh, Key and important with Wally and Eve. Eve in the story, uh, remember that she has sort of the seed of life in her belly, right? I mean, pregnant. She's got the plant like in right where her like uterus would be if she were a person, but she is also shaped like a giant and colored like a giant egg. Um, Kind of important though that and when her arms fold in too, she just and her head goes down into it, she becomes the egg entirely. So she's an egg that wakes up, but not an egg like Baymax where he's upright and positive. She has a subtle inverted quality, the downward pointing triangle, an egg on its bottom or top or whatever you want, an egg upside down. Um, Again, it has that teetering quality. It lets us know visually that she is possibly threatening, which initially she definitely is. That's part of her arc. So all of those symbols tell you so much about her, that she is associated with roundness, motherhood, the rebirth of life on the planet, that she's chaotic where Wally is ordered. Also, that she's threatening and powerful. She's got weapons on her. She initially comes in as a very like um, you're not even sure if she's going to turn out to be positive at the start. She just looks like a threatening kind of thing. But you do know because she is so round and so appealing. She doesn't look like a crazy Cylon coming in to destroy everything. So all of that is hidden in the design, so that when you see her, you immediately know those things. And when the story unfolds around her and those story beats are arrived at, they make a kind of emotional and intuitive sense. Um, and that's my favorite. And so we're going to dig into that specifically now. So, character design as it relates to its use in story. My favorite and most powerful example of that is the alien, xenomorph from the movie Alien. Um, a lot of the examples I'm going to use right now are pretty negative character design examples, but that's a big part of eliciting an emotional response. Um, and some of the most memorable things that stick with you always stem from an emotional response you have to something, and fear is one of those things. But you can throw teeth and pointy shapes on anything, and people do all the time. You know, you've got just like Transformers running around. They're just a jumble of triangles and squares and uh, unreadable and unclear. Um, and in contrast to that, even within the non-animated space, the alien is, I think, just one of the most powerful examples of design. Um, Key elements of the alien, right, are this oblong head, and he's the perfect example. I found this ink piece over here, um, and I'm not sure about its origins, but I love it because it takes what is actually a quite complicated design, all this anatomy and rib caging and bio sort of robot what is it called, biomechanical sort of visual language that Giger worked into the alien as a design, but it can be simplified in swipes of a single ink brush, and you immediately know what it is. You also still get all of the symbolism and the emotional impact from this version that you do from this version. This is scarier in some senses because it's made much more realistic. You see that it's real, and that has its own level of threat to you. Um, but in its symbolic gestural form, it's still scary, and that's powerful design. Um, Obviously, the fact that it's pitch black and sort of wet and shiny um, definitely play a part in that, right? Those largely to do with the fact like black darkness, it vanishes into dark places in the movie, which makes it terrifying. You can almost never make out the entire shape of the design, um, which is key in a great way that they use it in story. The shininess, like you can just pick out the pinpricks of light when it begins to enter the frame, and that's terrifying. Um, we have a total fear as people, like human beings in general, of dark water and things deep down underneath the water. And so the idea of evoking that with the ripples and shines and darkness that come out on the alien are key. Um, Huge part of the design, obviously, that it's sort of this emaciated, skeletal, sort of elongated form that we immediately see and associate with hunger and death. So, there you go. You've got black, shiny, dark water, night threat, right? Skeletal, claw like fingers, emaciated, skeletal hunger form, right? So you know this thing wants to eat, right? You got these huge, weird protrusions out of the back, which, again, sort of threatening, triangular, jagged shapes um, that evoke a sense of threat. But you don't even need those for the design. The most central thing to the alien, and I know this because as a kid growing up in like middle school, you could just see somebody, and all they would have to do is scribble this, you know, and you knew what it was. And even as a kid, without seeing the movies, I knew that was scary and cool. Like it had a long head, and I'd never seen anything like that before, you know. And if you just add rib cage elements, you know, sloppily and spine of the backbone, it's long, barbed tail, spikes, right? It's just a predatory shape. But bear with me because, you know, ultimately the alien's design revolves around the fundamental fact that its head is a giant penis. Um, the the fear, the fundamental like gut level fear in Alien is all about birth and reproduction, right? You've got face huggers that attach, they come out of glorpy, sort of wrong, you know, nasty eggs that don't work like eggs should in our understanding, right? This hand comes out, and the hand, the face hugger. Sorry, spoiler alert if you haven't seen Alien, right? It attaches to your face, and it impregnates the victim, right? And an alien bursts violently out of your chest and grows. And so nothing could be more sort of perfect to sort of quintessentialize that than the fear of the phallus, which is what the alien represents, this impregnating predatory force. Um, Geiger's work is powerful as a character designer. Uh, he is you once you've seen it, you'll remember it forever, right? You look up H.R. Giger online, you know what his work looks like already. If you haven't seen it before, as soon as you look at it, you'll recognize it from places. Um, I, it's really upsetting and disturbing to me, if I'm honest. But as a character designer, I respect it deeply. Because he went to some pretty dark places personally. You can tell in his work the amount of it, the intensity of it, the detail, the consistency of his themes. It's clear that this was a person who was struggling with some really dark stuff, and the themes that get in his own work really explicit in terms of its violence and sexuality are really hard to look at, grapple with, understand. His work is full of really explicitly sexual stuff that's mixed with the visuals of corpses. There's dead babies hooked up to, you know, obscure and unknowable machines that are. It's just upsetting. It's not the kind of work that I would ever want to do. But out of that, they were able to find a way to use that design language to create the world of Alien and create an enduring design aesthetic that still is powerful symbolically. Um, so I won't dig too much more into that, but I think, you know, it's pretty clear to see what the visual metaphor is with something like the Alien. But it's this great synthesis of all of these different fearful human things, and you wouldn't get the same design by just throwing shapes at it. You know, you have to really come at it from a conceptual point of view. You don't necessarily arrive at the alien by just throwing jagged lines at a page and eventually something emerges. Um, I don't want to be mean about other people's character design work in general, so I'm going to try not to be. There's a lot of design and film out there where the aesthetic feels like that, like it's emerged just from a random sort of series of images generated by people throwing shapes at a page, instead of thinking about what it really is that scares them or what is really appropriate for the story. Um, so moving on from that, I think two more examples of scary design work, and we'll move on. Um, I think Hayao Miyazaki is an incredible designer and storyteller. He's just pretty much my favorite living artist. Um, and No Face is an unbelievable design for that reason. Again, just black, unknowable, no clear limbs, you know, no clear anatomy. Everything kind of obscured and kept really tight. But the pop, the contrast moment, right? The mask. And the mask has this unsettlingly neutral expression. The eyes are narrowed, the mouth is neutral, right? It holds the triangles that evoke tears, but also go up and down. Uh, the mask just kind of sits there and stares at you. And when you make something that simple, it's hard to it's hard to balance that so perfectly that it's unsettling. But the shapes involved and the fact that it's set as this single light contrast point against dark give us the sense of there's something dark here that's wearing a mask to sort of make itself more appealing and positive. The white mask is trying to sort of humanize this dark form. And it's made perfect by the fact that, and again, spoiler alert for Spirited Away, that when he finally shows his true mouth, it's in his stomach. Like when No Face transforms, the teeth and enormous hungry mouth come right out of the middle of its stomach, and I just gosh, I love that. And for the moment when it happens narratively, it's a visual surprise, but it's also one of those things that because you were already unsettled by him, because you already knew that his face was an unmoving mask, and you didn't trust it, because already his body was a vague black form that wasn't clear how it worked or what it was. When it transforms, something in you is like, I expected that, or I didn't know that was going to happen, but it feels right that it did. And the fact that his stomach and his mouth are in the same place is just very simple, elegant design, right? The misdirection. Look at my face, but here's my stomach. Here's my actual face is just all about hunger, and his design ultimately is just about that longing and hunger and the desire and the deception of it. Um, but I love how Hayao Miyazaki repurposes those symbols to create a character who's nuanced and in the end is embraced by his hero. So these symbols don't have to be the end all be all of the character in the narrative. Hayao Miyazaki takes powerful negative design and turns it into powerful redemption and these positive moments, and subverts your expectations by cleverly designing his characters and then using them cleverly in his stories. A more direct example of a negative but excellent design surprise is the Pale Man from Guillermo del Toro's Pan's Labyrinth. Uh, just another brilliant design. Again, very similar to No Face in that something's missing. There's an element of deception. His eyes aren't there, but suddenly, when he wakes up, his hands come up, and it's the fact that looking and grabbing are the same thing for this design, this creature, I think is just brilliant and totally terrifying. And all the details, the pale, skeletal, hungry look of him, the fact that he looks like the folds of skin have that look of somebody who was enormous and engorged, maybe obese, but has lost a lot of weight rapidly, makes you think of that maybe this is a creature who was hungry, or is hungry, but was once well fed, and there's a disturbing implication to that too. But everybody remembers the moment of surprise, and you create that surprise by setting up the question: where are its eyes? Right? It's sleeping. You can't tell it's really sleeping. You're not sure if it's awake or asleep. So there's this unsettling moment when she approaches the table, and you can't tell her its nostrils, its eyes. Is it awake? Is it gonna see me? And the moment that it reaches for her and that it sees is kind of all in the same surprise of its eyes are on its hands, and that iconic kind of pose that you're seeing here. It's just great design. So designing for narrative is just one of those huge wonderful things, and it sticks in the memory when you can create something that pays off visually. That's my favorite kind of character design stuff. So just further examples, breaking down some shapes in classic stuff. I brought up this thing, and it's not even always in the point of this particular example, is that it's not even always in the silhouette or all of the big shapes or adding costume or draping them in strange symbolic things. It can be in the tiny nuances that you communicate things with symbol and with shape. Um, so, like we were talking about, right? Scar has a black mane to differentiate him from the other lions. He's the only one with this dark mane that evokes night and unknowing mystery and sort of that sense of primal threat, right? Both he and Mufasa have this sort of triangular sort of cheek shape, but his are a lot pointier, more jagged and downward. His bit of beard gives him a further downward pointing triangle, creates a shape. Most notably, and very subtly, his nose is like a mirrored series of downward pointing triangles. So the same shapes that are his cheeks and his chin are mirrored almost exactly in the pointed shapes of his nose. Eyebrows obviously pointier and more arched. Um, his shapes all kind of point down, and the classic namesake example giving you that unsettling asymmetry. Kind of like Jafar, he's a dabbler in places the other lions, the other characters in the movie don't dare go, and so he has this asymmetrical scar that gives him his name, but also gives you a sense that there's a history, a past, and something more going on with this character. By contrast, Mufasa, big square shapes, big square mouth, um, order, father, the responsibility and society, and he is all of those things in this very subtle way. Where Scar is a collection of triangles, Mufasa is a collection of soft, rounded squares. Doesn't mean it's only that. Doesn't mean it reads forever, but it is a key difference between the two characters. I mean, in every instance that you're noticing that you're like, oh, I associate him with squarishness. It should be subtle, and in some ways, a lot of these things aren't things that a character designer is going to be explicitly thinking about. But after the fact, you can see that those differences are in there to be found, and they're often repeated enough and seem to be something that works powerfully for large swaths of audience, to evoke these symbols. Again, bringing back that commedia dell'arte style of mask theater, you're evoking good, orderly father threatening asymmetrical uncle who dabbles in the dark, right? With aspects of these designs. Um, More Pixar examples that I have. I think I might breeze through really quick. So again, just a quick read on the family in The Incredibles here. We'll just focus on them and what works for them character design, right? Mr. Incredible, obviously big T shape, which is kind of just classic superhero mostly. But he doesn't favor the downward pointing triangle because he's got his gut. He's rounded off, right? Big round shapes. But also big square shapes, like his, especially you can tell they're stylizing subtly in squares with his legs here, his big squared off leg muscles. His head and jaw, this square shape, his receding hairline tells a certain part of his story too. Um, the head that goes right into the neck, classic set of shapes. Little ears, even things like that. There's, gosh, this is just such a. It was already. I think we've already gone over an hour, and we're only scratching the surface. And I hope this is informative and useful. But there's so much more here, and none of it's a set of rules. Whoa, that was loud. None of it's a set of rules, but so much of it is a series of patterns that you really can see oft repeated. A lot more square in him. Mrs. Incredible, key sort of roundishness of the hips creates her sort of pear-shaped upward pointing triangle. Um, Her hairstyle rounds out her head, swoops, right? Um, you kind of create this classic mother kind of look for her. So squarish, orderly father, sort of rounded shapes for mom. Um, and Dash and Violet both have very sort of specific little subtle cues. And again, since these are very basic designs, their costumes are almost identical across the set of them. It's the little cues. Dash's little hairdo that sort of tells the story of a wavy, unpredictable, sort of chaotic speedster is perfect and so simple. And Violet, as you recall, has this long, straight, dark hair that she uses often to hide behind. Um, so you're creating these moments, and they're not necessarily all always about the giant shape language, because sometimes you're creating a really simple set of human characters for a movie. Um, but even in all of that, you're still trying to find those opportunities to create uh, little bits of storytelling in the design that help serve the overall whole, the story of the film or the project in general. Um, Again, example after example, Inside Out's characters are classically sort of symbol oriented, right? Um, Anger's got that. When he's angry, his head catches on fire, which gives you this big asymmetrical, chaotic element that we definitely associate with anger. Square, order, fairness, right? Uh, Anger is most often triggered when things aren't fair, when they don't make sense. This sort of version of anger that they explore is largely the sort of orderly minded one. You might think, I'm forgetting, it's joy, envy, sadness, anger, and fear, or yeah, I can't remember Panic. He looks like Panic from Hercules, actually, which is funny. Um, Thin, spindly, off kilter. The spiral again, sort of chaotic. The big round eyes kind of offset at a funny angle. Um, but largely, his great symbolism happens in this jittery, checkered, upward and downward triangular pattern on his shirt. Um, Kind of creates this scratchy, panicked, kind of evokes that in the design. Um, Sadness, rounded, sort of droplet shape, looks like a tear in her own way. Um, Soft, sad, squishy. Um, she is often sort of lying around and kind of in a puddle on the floor, and so the association with water and with tears is really strong. I remember them talking about how they wanted Joy to stylize as though she were like a star. She's always bursting with energy, so she's all these triangles going out in different directions. But even in her hair, you get that classic upward triangle. And Envy, a little trickier here, but the sort of asymmetry, big triangle swinging out there. Um, she's the trickiest one for me, and I'm not sure she's the most successful symbolic design. I wouldn't say that means she's a bad or unsuccessful design. Um, Obviously, not every design has to resonate through the halls of eternity or something like that. Um, but I still would say that when it comes down to it, uh, Envy is kind of relying more heavily on her attitude, um, and looking like kind of a classic, sarcastic kind of DreamWorks face, kind of pretty girl vibe, for her appeal. And that does get into something too, right? There's aspects to this. Symbol is not going to get you there on its own. Symbol is a tool, and there are other tools. And a big tool beyond the symbol and metaphor of what you're trying to communicate um, is just your ability to draw. Your ability to draw, your craftsmanship, Your ability to work natural appeal into your characters is huge. Big, appealing round eyes and big, soft and enjoyable shapes, and learning how to create shapes that flow into each other believably and naturally is this just the result of studying, from life. Understanding color is its own sort of separate thing that relates to all of this as well. Um, but anatomy and shape and all of that, and I would say, like, in terms of an analogy, those are like your ability to speak the English language. You need to learn that first. You need to be able to draw and create appealing characters that just look nice and natural and have that sort of quality of a practiced expertise. Um, Going into the symbolism and the metaphor is like experimenting with poetry. Now you've moved on from your ability to speak the English language. But it's not enough that you just are able to say words. Now it's on you to decide what it is you want to say and how beautifully and eloquently you want to say it. And so, in terms of the building blocks and the principles, I think I have a better handle on that years later and because of school, but by no means am I the world's greatest poet, and there's just so many incredible designers out there and such amazing design happening. But a lot of it is I would say there's a lot of noise too. And my hope with Jellybots and in general is to create characters that are conceptually compelling, and visually I work as much as I can with metaphor and with symbol, and trying to tease those out of the designs. Um, One, I'm very nervous sort of throwing my work up against all these others, but one example, just to sort of tie it back in, that I would use is the example of this character Twist. And I currently developing, still figuring out all the aspects of the design. But two key elements of Twist in Twist Jelly have been a big part of my thinking, and then a third one has been a relatively new development. But largely, Twist is this human character, and their jelly sort of betrays their subconscious. Within that, it's this miasma of different masks, different faces, false faces, and this sense of a performed self, and trying to really riff on that idea of the false self that kind of begins with that concept of no face. No face has the single false face, and is a very reserved and kind of introverted character for the majority of the film. Twist is a meditation on somebody who's a much more theatrical presence, a much more shape-shifting, face-changing kind of person who, at the center, doesn't really understand or know who they are, but through their performance is searching and looking for their identity. And so, playing with this motif of morphing, twisting, changing masks and faces, and speaking with different voices was always key. And floating those in a black jelly, mystery and night, evoking neon and the nighttime was key for the color palette. Um, but the Rorschach test kind of aesthetic of a chaotic kind of jelly that almost looked like black fire to me was key. Um, yeah, kind of bringing in that idea of chaos, the little symbolic note of Rorschach kind of psychology tests, and sort of the search for symbols, um, as well as, yeah, the fire and the dark of night combined. So that was a big driving force behind that design, which I felt was one of the more successful ones of the sort of line of Jellybots designs I've been working on. Um, and then more recently, I'm still working on the details and figuring out the rest, but the motif of the maze mask with the faces hidden within it was something that I've been playing with a lot, that I've been really enjoying the notion of. And if you recall from previous videos, probably in other bits of Jellybots, there are a number of faces hidden inside of the geometry of the mask. And just that idea to me is personally a little more interesting than just throwing a lot of crazy shapes at a design. Um, Obviously, with Jellybots, I'm able to throw crazy shapes at a design while simultaneously doing more subtle stuff on the human figure themselves. And so that's been a huge fun angle on the design work for these characters, is being able to do kind of both as I go. Create big, bold silhouette shapes, but also get into the specifics of what I wanted to say about a character um, through their outfit and the specificity of what they're about. Um, so I think that's probably a decent place to stop for now. I know this has been very talky and it's gone on for quite a long while. I really hope it was useful and enlightening for you. It was really fun for me to put together. It's definitely an ongoing work in progress, and I'd love to hear from you guys what you think, any questions you have, and indications of things you'd like to see in the future. Um, from here, I'm going to fill the post with a couple of links to other resources that I think might be useful if you're working on your own through figuring out character design as you go. I'd love to be of help and to sort of help figure out, what questions you have and the way to some of those answers. Again, I'm on that journey with you, and I'm still figuring it out myself. It's frustrating sometimes to feel like you can look at these designs and see what's working, but not reproduce it in your own work. Um, so it's an ongoing journey for all of us, but I'm personally always really lit up and excited about the idea that character design can be more and more compelling and more to do with story and world building than just what it might seem like on the surface. Thank you so much for taking your time and listening and taking a look at all of this. Again, hit me up in the comments, let me know what you think, and I will see you with a whole bunch of new work next month. Thank you so much for your support. Cheers.